You can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment for more content like this. Barry lambasted his. He pressed his palm against the emergency override switch, and the lockdown hissed behind him, leaving no one else to join him. Declared that no one was allowed to touch Commander Estimal, who was lying on the medical table with her armor sliced open and severely burned by plasma, purple skin sticky across her ribs, her chest heaving in short, laborious breaths. Barry wasted no time. The stated treatment regimen was a farce, and she was sweating and had black hair stuck to her face. He yanked up his privates after reading the molecular scans, which showed that her body wasn't shutting down but rather fighting the wrong battle. Using a silver injector, he inserted the needle into the muscle directly beneath her collarbone without his hands shaking, and he moved back as he pulled the trigger, causing her eyes to fly open and her voice to crack. She hissed poorly as I watched her pulse soar and her veins light up beneath her skin. You were dying, and I was fighting. As her vitals stabilized and then improved, the monitors chirped, but she continued to look at him. What did you inject? Barry folded his arms. But you're lying, stabilizing him. Her hand jerked, nearly reaching for his throat. You want to die. I'll take it back out. Her eyes didn't soften, but her breathing decreased. Observed him as if he were a puzzle. Then she grinned, not out of appreciation, but as a warning. And Barry, for the first time in Barry, was cataloguing his remorse when she made him feel hot for years. Returned, he had just time to turn around when Estimal came stomping through the door, upright and threatening the dark. Her eyes were fixed on him, and her uniform clung to her like it had been sewn into muscle. Her stride was graceful and lethal. He took note of everything that was his, even the flushed dark skin and wide pupils that ran down the side of her chest and along her throat. Reading bodies is my business, but this one read like a ticking fuse. What did you put in me? Her voice wasn't I would consider it a medical miracle that Barry didn't glance up from the file he was carrying, and that you are walking. Interfered. She was now 5 feet away, not close enough to hit, but close enough to make him consider what she could do with her hands. My skin burns, she murmured, and my breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Barry put the file down, but she walked on the localized inflammation. I can hear it in my ears and hear her lips as my blood gets thicker and faster. With her mouth slightly open, she touched the inside of her lower lip, as if she were tasting a word she wasn't sure how to pronounce. He remarked calmly, "My body is reacting to the stabilizer," and she shook her head. I did scans, and she stated my results were inaccurate. Therefore, I'm not going to the compound for you. Hormone levels are rising. Bioelectric patterns have changed, and my neuroreceptors are keyed to a single, I can't sleep because of an environmental trigger that made her eyelids narrow. Barry blinked once. I'm having trouble focusing since I'm thinking about your voice, hands, and pulse. Her voice fell an octave in heat. Over each word, and worst of all, Barry arched an eyebrow. I suppose this is all really annoying, for I didn't need you to inject me, and you broke all the rules. I saved your life, she stepped in. I know you used something experimental, but you went too far now that he could smell the taste of her ozone. Her voice broke just a little bit, but I took the one chance I had, and now I feel everything. The heat on my skin caused her to flex her hands as if she had forgotten how to recognize them. She looked up, and even your Estimal's eyes shimmered on her body, and everything was louder. Wasn't only getting better, she understood that it was changing and that I needed to halt it. Murmured, I can't undo it, and Barry replied, not yet. I don't even know what Barry's jaw tightened as he tilted his head and said, I'll study what your system is doing. She moved closer. Are you serious? His hand went to his wrist, curling its fingers around his pulse as her flesh burned. You touched me without my consent once, she whispered gently. If you're going to touch me again, do it correctly. She held out her. On the other hand, perform your diagnostics while using your hands, since his throat was whatever he had done to her. Dry Estimal was still blazing from the inside out. Barry didn't speak at the door, so whatever the stabilizer activated wasn't finished yet, and she wasn't just a patient anymore. Shut down. There are no cameras present, just a medic with a history of one illegal compound and an extraterrestrial officer whose estimatal sat on the edge of the table with his knees slightly apart, his blood wanting more of him than science could explain. Vitals first, she remarked with confidence, and Barry keyed the scanner, which chirped to while conducting baseline diagnostics. His gaze swept across the higher results. Adrenaline sped up neuronal overactivity, hormone cascades, and cellular repair. He mumbled, "Looking at human mating triggers, she's not healing, she's adapting." Although she responded in her voice that she already knew he had stared at her, Barry looked into her eyes and said, "You're in a phase change. Your body has chemically returned its attention on a single catalyst through the rewiring of your brain. As if biological bonds don't form, we don't couple." And the Estimal's jaw stiffened. "You're not controlling me, Barry. You're just strategically dominating the reproductive system," remarked quietly. "Why are your pupils dilated?" Her smile was gradual, but he chose to ignore it. The stabilizer adhered to the entire neuroerotic cascade, not only the reproductive center, and was connected to your hormonal axis, your primary means of survival. She leaned forward. "And why didn't he?" I carefully slipped from the table with my bare feet on the floor and finished the blink me estimate. "Use your hands, Barry," she whispered, placing his fingertips softly against her throat to track the pulse velocity. He slipped a diagnostic as he skimmed the side of her torso, stopping just above the old wound site. Her skin radiated electricity. He inquired after probing her back, reading and confirming that her spinal response was overclocked and hypersensitive, still burning, harsher agony. No. She took a deep breath, longing for Barry's hand to freeze mid-scan. Estimatal turned gently until they were only a few inches apart, chest to chest. "Your touch reduces the ache," she whispered, placing her hands softly on his sides. "Is that chemical?" "Tell yourself, while I'm straddling you." His voice fell, but he didn't move. His breath caught. "Damn her." Barry kept her stare and said, "You're not, so stop treating me like one of her. I don't want to be patient zero in your lab report." His hands remained on his hips while his hold tightened slightly. That tiny movement set off all of his body's signals. He dropped the scanner because her skin was begging for more, and they continued to stare at one another for a half second. Then, as if to erase every line he had drawn, he seized her by the waist, twisted her back onto the table, and planted a kiss on her. Gave him a passionate kiss in return, as if she were famished, and then Barry tugged at his jacket collar and control. "You're not in control," he muttered, breathing heavily and keeping his mouth inches from hers. Estimatal's eyes widened, demonstrated by the fact that he moved without saying anything, and that his subsequent touch with her was not clinical, but rather personal, and it altered. Barry assumed he was having hallucinations when he first saw her again that night, because the lab was dark. Estimatal stood at the entrance, backlit by the murky corridor, despite the fact that the lights had been turned out an hour before. Her hair was moist, and she was wearing a thin black jacket that was zipped halfway up behind her. Barry remained at his desk and observed her, saying, "I can't sleep." I obviously didn't come to chat to her because of her low, gruff voice. He entered slowly and methodically, resembling a predator, but this was not exactly hunting. Something else, much more perilous, made her stop in front of him. "I needed to stop," she said. She sat down on the edge of the desk and faced him, her knees scraping his while she gazed at her fingers on the floor. She whispered, "I hate needing anything from anyone, but I'm not Talith training," she claimed. "Neutralizes emotional variance after puberty, which is why I should feel this way. I couldn't care less if you vanished tomorrow." Her eyes finally met his. "Stop feeling your silence encircling them." He simply moved forward till she was there, without grabbing her or leaning in. Her breath seized in her throat as her knees squeezed against his thighs. "You want it to stop?" he murmured, and she gulped a yes. "You want me to reverse what I did?" "Yeah," he said. But Barry stretched out, and he put his fingers softly on her jaw, causing her skin to tremble as if it were famished. But she said, "I don't." He leaned in and hovered his lips just over hers, saying, "Tell me what you want to stop. I want this out of me. You're lying." She clutched his collar, her hands balled into fists on his chest. He gave her everything, including every skin-to-skin contact, gasping groan, and desperate kiss. When he eventually got inside, her heartbeat was a plea, and she arched like a live wire, her air bursting from her lungs. Her voice and the half-moon marks her nails left on his back weren't simply for fun. When she came, her entire body seemed to be recalibrating in mid-motion, as if a system had rebooted under pressure. Her skin flashed around him, and he heard a heartbeat before they collapsed into each other, their bodies slippery, and Barry sensed that she was twisted and trembling before hearing the monitor chirping from the wall and seeing that her vitals were rising. Nerve reactions are exploding as the pulse's oxygen saturation tripled. He said, "Estimal," but she didn't answer. Her eyes were open but distracted. Barry carefully lifted her and placed her out flat after she jerked once beneath him when he grabbed the scanner. As he started a full-body diagnostic, his fingers flew across the console. "Come on, remain with me." Her skin was, this inquiry wasn't, completed since the BOF feedback systems were glowing dimly and overwhelming whatever the stabilizer had activated. Mark, this was only the first time Barry had witnessed a soldier collapse at a threshold. He had witnessed hormone breakdowns, overdoses, and neurological snaps, but this wasn't that typical, wasn't seizing. Instead, she was shifting, her pupils short-circuiting beneath the skin and her muscles twitching like wires. Flickered, adapting quicker than any baseline reaction in the event that her jaw locked, mouth opened, and breath heaved like her body. He checked everything, neurologic, endocrine, and metabolic, but was unable to determine whether it needed more or less air, sensation. "This shouldn't be happening," he whispered, as the table's skin turned a deeper purple and the Estimal arched once again. Barry bent over her and held her face between his, while the faint glow at her sternum pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Though her eyes were open and watery, Estimal didn't look at me. Half here, half in some invisible internal battleground, he reached for a cold pack and applied it to her back. Her back smacked firmly on the table as she gasped, startling her system. Barry leaned in and punched her lungs, saying, "You're overheating. I need to lower your core temperature." Did she choke out? Barry was crouching down to the table, brushing his hair when he froze and thought, "Don't take your hands off me. Your body is in a hypersync loop, and I need to control your nerve flow based on her face. I'm not even sure how I'm not awake, but I can feel everything again, even worse than before." She swallowed hard. Barry muttered something under his breath as her grip tightened the moment I set off something else. He brought her to the recovery bed in the rear of the medbay beyond the table, so don't regret it. She weighed little in his arms, but heat radiated from her like it was illuminated by scanners past the chilly lights. He laid her down gently, inside, and she gripped his forearm tightly, refusing to let go. "You're stabilizing," he murmured. "No." Barry sat next to her and asked, "What do you mean?" Her voice was still raw as she said, "I'm transforming. I felt it the second I touched you." Barry's forehead furrowed. The relationship wasn't simply chemical, it was in me, not just in my flesh. Specifically, you're now within my nervous system, because Estimatal's breath halted. She didn't cut him off. "But I can sense you when you enter a room, and when you breathe next to me, my body falls in love with you." Barry looked away from her Estimal. It was no longer just desire. She recognized a pattern and turned around. "Barry, it's gone so deep that you could tell me to quit breathing right now, and I would try." "No," she answered, swallowing hard. "I didn't design that compound to control you." She held his cheek and said, "But you did something deeper. You rewrote my instinct." Barry leaned against as her flesh chilled between his fingers, her heartbeat slowed. He exhaled. "There's no protocol for this. No scientific method can reverse it." "I know," he murmured, and then her body sagged. Her eyes rolled back, her vitals flickered, and he caught her before she fell. Once more, it was too low, so Barry muttered a groan and turned on the vitals monitor. Barry stood above her, observing. A lady who had previously frightened the entire system, but now her system was going into a stasis cycle. Squads now lies in bed, his hands shaking and his skin shining dimly in the dark like a charged battery in sleep mode, since he was aware that she wouldn't wake up the same the next day. And whatever bond they had, just Barry stood in the silence that had been created between them, where the medbay didn't produce any noise until someone was dying, over Estimal's body for the third continuous hour, observing a rhythm that no monitor could detect and a pulse he couldn't measure. He whispered, applying a cool compress to her temple. Come on, since she hadn't flatlined. You don't get to violate biological rules and then check out. Her skin had cooled to an odd neutrality, yet it was still alive and not dead. The pulsing beneath her skin had ceased, and it now shimmered subtly, like a signal attempting to choose whether to broadcast or disappear. Barry sat on the bed's edge and observed her chest rise and then remain. He muttered to the calm, "But you're not." And he remained motionless for 7 seconds before the next breath came. I've seen reboots before. Rebooting, he extended 2 fingers down her forearm, feeling the skin beneath it twitch, but not the muscles. Felt conscious that she was still altering deeply, and then suddenly, she took a breath and opened her eyes. Estimal, he said slowly, but she didn't respond immediately. Her fingers twitched as if they were unfamiliar with the texture of the sheets, and she just blinked once and then again. I was gone, she murmured, her voice still strong but softer, as Barry leaned in, as if everything around her had just changed. How long did you know? All of it, she answered, then gave him a serious glance and grinned. Barry froze. You haven't seen me like this before, he said, changing the Estimal's hand and finding his knee. I felt the commander's rage as I observed every tiny change in her stance, posture, and breathing. Barry's forehead is wrinkled now, and it's quieter than before, she whispered. When my flesh finally reached my blood, she raised his hand and held it in hers. You held me in place. Barry shook his head. And that's... She gripped his fingers. But I don't care medically. I've studied every science my people have, and there is no technique for... I know, she leaned, but this doesn't make up for what you did to me. It matters because he sensed her excitement as her forward eyes flicked down to his lips and returned to his eyes. Changed once more, her warmth transforming into heat, and their delicate attraction rekindled as if it had never died. Waited and asked, Do you sense it? She straddled him and asked, but Barry didn't stop her. She took a seat on his lap, her knees tucked into his hips as though they were meant to be there, and her fingers slipped under his shirt. I need that estimate without titles, she said. You're cooler than I remember. No, he didn't flinch as she leaned in and brushed his nose. You want control. She never lost it, and this time she kissed him to claim him rather than out of hunger. After testing, Barry's hands went to her waist, stabilizing her while her hips moved, putting just enough pressure on her to cause her to gasp for air. You sure? He asked low. She nodded against his mouth. I'm certain about you. After lying wrapped together in silence, they moved deeper and more slowly this time. She touched his jaw and said, You're not done with me. Barry opened his eyes and said, You don't sound like you're... She grumbled, Not anymore. Then she tightened her hold on his wrist. But I'll warn you about what Barry looked at her definition of normal, and this isn't going away. I'll still want command, she said, sitting up with her bare skin shining in the dim light. Stated, I already knew that I'll remain dangerous and sharp, but now she. Barry's voice was firm as he leaned in close, saying, I don't scare you. Although Easy Estimatal's eyes were burning, her smile was cunning. If the knock wasn't a Barry, was already upright when the knock came, his shirt half-buttoned, his boots unlaced, and an Estimal stood behind him. She whispered, "Don't answer it," with her arms crossed and her brows furrowed. "It's too late for something." He proceeded to the control panel to examine the external display, which showed two people wearing the Interstellar Oversight Coalition Joint Military Liaison human insignia. One of the men said, "I don't take walk-ins," and he keyed the microphone facilities on restricted lockdown, walked forward, his face dull and square, as if it had been machine-carved. "Dr. Carver, please get down. We are authorized by Article 17 to examine and extract the subject estimate." Barry switched off the microphone and faced her. "Did you realize they would arrive so quickly? They were observing you as soon as you believe they knew I would touch you. Use that compound." Estimatal grinned, but Barry muttered a curse and reached for his jacket, hoping you would. "I can stop them if I declare you're unstable. You're correct," she cut in. He turned, and she was now approaching him. She had already zipped up her black jacket, her pale skin still glowing like a storm in containment against the dark fabric. "They will dissect you if they have the opportunity," he murmured in a hushed voice. Estimal went immediately to the door after hearing a harder knock, while Barry moved. "I'm not running," she responded, warning him, "You can't stop me from standing where I belong." "I'm not planning a legal standoff," she said, opening the door, and Barry held his. When the two soldiers saw her, they didn't blink or draw their firearms, which would have been against the law. They reached for their belt data tabs, prepared to record Commander Estimal, the taller one, even if there was no verified threat. Said in a dry tone, "The Xenogenic Division of High Command has ordered you to submit to a thorough medical review." The shorter one responded with a foreign bonding hormone as Estimal cocked her head under what charge pollution. Barry took the initiative to weaponize unapproved neurochemicals. The tall one stated, "You're also underweight, and you realize how thin that sounds, Doctor." Review. You changed her neurological imprint, causing an estimated cut in her brain, yet I saved her life. Further maintained interspecies relations by averting the murder of a senior Tithith commander during and Barry tightened his fists throughout the active treaty cycle, and you linked with him after the brief one didn't flinch. She's not a weapon, but the tall one claimed that she's both Estimal and stepped between. "To be sure," she said in a quiet voice, "that no one touched me but him in the air." When the shorter soldier asked, "I'm refusing invasion," she answered, and both soldiers went rigid. The taller soldier's voice fell half a register as he said, "There's a difference. If you do not comply, we are authorized. To begin a tactical transfer, physical force is allowed." Barry moved to stand next to her and said, "Touch her," and the towering soldier patted his cool head and said, "This is Lieutenant Hale. Subject refuses." Neither soldier moved. After a civilian transfer intervened and suggested escalation to command-level arbitration, a straightforward response verified, they walked out and slowly shut the door behind them, using a palm press. And 3, "You know what they're going to do now, don't you?" she added, referring to the silent directives that caused the bolt lights to turn red. She advised spinning it as a violation, making it louder, or leaking it to the Tithith Council. Barry took his coat and walked out of the meeting, saying, "We need time. We don't. Contamination used it as political leverage. Have it." He halted, and we made it. She observed his eyes sweeping across his face. "You have a strategy," he whispered, and we disappeared. He stepped in close, his hands sliding behind her neck and settling there like an anchor as his jaw twitched. "You'd run with me," he remarked. "This just speeds up the timeline." And I had already made up my mind. Through her nose, more like a reassessment than a sigh. What should we say to them? Barry didn't say anything. They had already determined who we were. She nodded once. She kissed him, and then withdrew, saying, "Let's disappear." Barry was already packed. "I'll be who they fear." Due to a practice shortcoming, the medication estimator began deconstructing the compound's internal communication relay, informing him she had previously eliminated location traces and memory modules to eliminate any possibility of a heat signature. that may lead them to the lab appeared to have been offline for weeks within 10 minutes at the door. Estimal turned and glanced back only once. Barry responded, "They'll chase us. I hope they do." And she grinned before they left. All of it disappeared, along with the medbay, the station, the building they had constructed, and the diplomatic, medical, and scientific buildings. Behind them, Barry had already picked a side, and the house was now the objective of the bond, rather than a secret. Barry stood silently on the borrowed residence front porch, gazing out over the expansive, wind-blown fields of the north. Tarvin is a rural area that is hardly visible on maps, surrounded by low hills and weather-blasted woodland, with no signals and just one. He didn't trust the screen behind him, which was a lane dirt road, and a location where creatures were supposed to cease following you. When the door creaked open, Estimal leaned next to him, her shoulder brushing the aged wood slats as her bare feet walked across them. Not because her complexion had altered, but because it was still light violet. She appeared human in this light, faultless and radiant in the early morning light. Yet because of the softer angles in her face, "You're thinking loud again," Barry mumbled. "I don't trust silence." And she tilted her head. "You..." He stared at her and said, "That wasn't silence. That was pressure." Her mouth twitched. "Still is. Trust me in it." I remained in that position for a minute, listening to the mist rise from the far-off woods. But Barry knew what she was referring to, how her body had jerked with alerts. Even behind sealed doors, back in the city, with muscle memory reacting to she was conditioned by tactical echoes and distant communications field frequencies. Her intellect had been educated to detect danger before it materialized, so armor wasn't the sole item made for combat. Now, there was she stated that nothing feels wrong or finally right, and Barry commented, "Quieter, she." She turned to face him, saying, "You like this quiet, no?" Barry shrugged and said, "They're off record, off duty, off everything." I'm still Estimatal moved in front of him, hiding the early sun, but I have 6 blood panels to test before noon. In other words, he glanced at her before letting Estimal, wearing a loose black shirt, hang one of his wet shoulder-length hairs. Barry arrived from the basin, where she was drying in curling waves that framed her face as though she was just discovering how to live. "I don't miss the war," he replied, touching her wrist. "You miss the rules. I miss them." She was halted because she knew who I was to you, and then she quietly moved forward, saying, "You're not my doctor anymore. No, you're not my goal." He chuckled briefly. "I wasn't sure for a while," she added. "So what am I?" "You're mine." That night the homestayed was a reality, not a claim, as Estimatal's fingertips touched the corner of his jaw. As she emerged from the shower, steam rising from her skin, the black animal walked through it as if she had lived there forever. Barry tried to be silent as he crawled onto his lap on the couch, while strolling barefoot across old wood flooring. Separated, but her body shaped itself to fit his, as if the substance had not just combined their biological makeup, but synchronized their gravitational pull. He softly kissed her, drawing her closer, and she kissed him as she shuddered beneath his lips. Back then, with the windows wide and the lights off, they made love as the wind cooled them. Her body shook at each movement, her skin still raw and sensitive. But he didn't tell. But she persisted in whispering his name into his breast. What happened to him after she rested her back on his chest, and he tightly wrapped his arm around her waist, neither of them. When she said, "Until I felt jealous today." Barry raised his head of what the 45-year-old clerk with the eye patch and limp is the woman you spoke to at the supply terminal. When you smiled at her, Estimal turned her head and remarked, "The crate of medical plasma." She patted your arm, Barry, and I grinned because that was the most rustic thing I've ever heard. She was stuck beneath a dead cow. She hissed, and you heard her laugh gently. "You're jealous, but I don't get jealous." He kissed the back of her neck and said, "Then stay scared." His voice turned soft, frightening me. She muttered, "This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to feel safe." "You don't have to be safe." Then she turned in his arms and pressed her forehead on his "Barry, yeah," and said, "Just stay. It continues to throb." He smiled wearily. "Where?" She slipped his hand beneath the... He kissed her once more after pressing the sheets down on her stomach. "There." And she and he both remained awake for hours, because someone was seeing the storm outside in the forest beyond the hills, where the quiet was starting to shift. Arrived at 3:47 a.m., causing the windows to bend due to an abrupt drop in pressure, and the floors creaked when the rain struck the roof as if they were upset to have discovered them. Barry quickly sat up. His hand was... When he felt her awaken behind him, he was nearly halfway to the pistol hidden beneath the bed. Her knees were hot and sweaty. She didn't open her eyes, but instead, wrapped in his arms, she said, "They're not here yet." Barry sighed. "I heard the storm and assumed." "You assumed correctly," she said in a quiet, low voice. But not he turned to see her lying on her side sheets, holding to the sharp dip of her waist, saying, "Not tonight yet." Her hand curled beneath her cheek, giving the impression that she was at ease, yet her body was quivering and her breath caught every. Her fingertips slid against the sheet as she inhaled, her thighs pressing together and then apart in faint pulses. Barry leaned over her as if she was looking for friction. "What's happening?" "It won't stop throbbing," she muttered. Her stomach twisted as she took his hand and ran it over her hip and down her ribs. She muttered, "It's," as his palm pressed low just below her navel, moving across the soft curve of her stomach. Barry glanced at her suffering, but her legs were shifting, and it woke me up. "I've done the diagnostics, and my neurological system is steady. However, it's involuntary again, and not a pain stimulation loop." Barry's pupils dilated as he squeezed his hand harder, and her Estimal arched into it. "But this is no longer mechanical." Pulled away a little to observe her intently. "What triggers it?" she said. She sat up slowly as she thought about you, hearing your words, feeling air travel across my skin, and smelling you. She responded, "I don't want it to stop this time." Barry stared at her, asking, "Why?" "Because now," she said. "I want it," she said in a gentle yet menacing voice, kissing him and pushing him away. Her hips jerked forward once as she climbed onto his lap with a confident, fluid motion that caused him to moan against her mouth. Barry tested her by grabbing her thighs and pushing his fingers into her sensitive flesh. "You started this," she whispered, gasping for air. You grabbed his wrist and forced his hand back to the center of her throb. Barry's jaw curled. "I saved your life, but you infected mine." She kissed down his neck, biting once, saying, "You're not complaining." Her lips touched his jaw because it was now mine to own. He threw her onto her back, and she giggled as his body responded before his head caught up, causing tightness to coil low in his spine. "Sincere and intelligent," she gasped, when he took hold of her wrists and secured them above her head while maintaining control. Barry taunted her by pressing slowly and steadily into her, causing her to tremble and lock her legs. Her eyelids flitted closed as she anchored him around his hips, and he claimed me. Her body responded more quickly, locking tighter, and she craved more as they danced together, as if there was no future beyond this moment. Barry gave it her all. When she arrived, she bit down on his shoulder and yelled to stop him from shaking, and when Barry halted as she fell against him, exhausted and pulsing, whispering, "I'm scared." "Of what?" Barry traced his thumb across. "Of what I'd do if I lost you." She drew back just enough to see his gaze. "You're not going to." Estimal grinned and said, "Weakness is the issue, I believe me. They didn't sleep. Instead, they used pillows and a tiny blanket from the hallway closet to lie on the floor." She ran her fingers over his, but her legs stayed entangled with his, as if she couldn't physically or emotionally separate them. Chest steadily and slowly. "And I used to feel nothing," she said. "I recall that following the program," they claimed. It was successful because I didn't experience a surge in my pulse rate, panic in the face of danger, or grief when we lost. My heart has been racing since Barry traced the inside of her wrist. Rushing, she pressed her lips to his neck, saying, "Don't touch me. I hear your voice." But she looked up what you had done to me when she saw your skin. And Barry didn't respond, because he didn't. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to gently sit up in the moonlight, nude, and unsure if the bond could be broken. Spilled on the floor of the living room as she gazed at the open window and added, "I had a dream that Barry propped himself up. Tell me, you were bleeding and we were surrounded. I had to decide whether to run or carry you. What did you do?" She stared at me. Barry swallowed hard as I retaliated by burning everything. "Would you do that again?" he said, but she didn't. She then climbed back into his arms and gripped him as if the world were already attempting to tear them apart, blinking. "I'd do worse." A drone Chile was being woken up by someone else beyond the hills, and the ancient field station that had previously reported Estimal's vitals lit up as it drifted silently through the night air. Green tracking received the message again, and it came silently with a blinking red light. Buried beneath the kitchen floor in the backup comm low-bandwidth analog link, she sat at the window with a mug of lukewarm tea in her hands, gazing into a metal case that Barry had forgotten existed. Barry tried to pretend that everything was still normal and that they were safe on the windless morning while boiling water. When the blink caught her eye, she stood without saying anything, even though they weren't ready for the next impossible decision yet. Barry turned and knelt by the floorboards in the kitchen, asking, "What is it?" The metal container hissed when she opened it, but the air pressure seal was still strong. She grabbed the slats with her bare hands. Inside, a hand-sized black block that is ancient technology by Earth standards, but one she quickly identified, the hardline emergency transmission node for the command relay. Barry was unaware that when he turned it on, the screen illuminated white before turning dark into a symbol. However, Barry did move behind her towel while holding it in his hand, according to Estimal's voice. Appeared flat, they ceased whispering. The symbol changed, and a face seemed to Lithmail used her native tongue to say, "Poison Commander Estimal, you're refusing. Your acts have been examined, and compliance has been acknowledged. This is your final directive, and the words have a greater impact. Upon returning to sector headquarters, any blast must promptly undergo a complete biological reset. Non-compliance will lead to your identification being revoked, your status being removed, and your bond being permanently designated as a compromised asset." Barry stepped around her, invalidating the human through emotional sterilization and memory extraction. "What does that do?" "Perform memory extraction," the voice went on, "and you will be healed. He will forget it, and the connection will be broken." The screen stayed active for an additional beat, after which it either responded within a single cycle or was mercilessly pursued. As Dark Barry gazed at her, he said, "They're serious. They'll take everything that's worth it." Barry paced once, but they won't have the chance. "Can we flee and hide again?" Estimatal stood steadily and slowly. They have moved and no longer care about the rules. He halted outside of his authority, so that's all. Estimatal didn't say anything, so she walked to the bedroom, opened the cabinet containing her old armor, and gazed at it for a while before turning. "And I'm not going back," she said to Barry as she took up the communication relay and shattered it in her bare hand. His air left him like she gripped his face in her hands and gave him a blow to the ribs, saying, "You understand me?" No reset, no sterilization. No. Barry drew her into his forehead and pressed it on hers, saying, "They'll kill you, they'll try. We don't." He claimed that she kissed him, then withdrew, and that we had a plan. Barry nodded in the neutral zone as he stated, "Pack your gear. We're leaving in an hour." Or near one. A city 300 meters east has no satellites, no sovereignty. Only through filth, perspiration, and illicit trade we can either vanish or begin anew. They packed light too, so even if they come, let them come. Caressed her face. By sunset, the cabin was completely cleaned, including satchels, a med kit, and a weapon bag. "Do you regret any of it?" asked Estimal as he stood in the front doorway, looking back at the location where they had learned to touch one another as if it were essential to their survival. "I regret not kissing you sooner," Barry said with a smile, and they left, saying that it had taken them 2 days to get there. Constructed into the bones of a partially abandoned mining town on the outskirts of the neutral city, they were given a room above a supply vendor's warehouse, 3 stories above a smuggler's medical clinic, and a back alley. Gunsmith they paid in estimatal offered stillness and a stare that caused the broker to stop breathing for 3 seconds. While trading, Barry offered surgical skills, complete seconds, and by the second night, they had unloaded. By the third night, the city abandoned them, but they continued to lock the door, but they slept soundly until one night when Estimal snuggled up in the dark. "I think the bond is permanent," Barry said, tracing his ribs with his chest fingers. Barry's arm was draped over her shoulders as she muttered. "You think, or you know I feel it in my hands," she said. "Even when I sleep." He kissed her temple, asking, "Are you scared?" "No." She moved. "I'm grateful." Barry grinned. "Why are you smiling?" she said, her hair cascading forward to frame her face as she landed on top of him. "Because this time," Estimal murmured, rocking her hips against his deep, steady voice. He pulled her down and kissed her as if no one else was there to pursue them, saying, "I want it." I, for the first time in the city, had only coordinates and no name for weeks, sitting beneath the sky never cleared, and the streets were filled with old smoke and heavy, oily clouds. Were all corroded steel power cables and broken stone that dangled like spider webs. Barry enjoyed the buildings, even if they appeared to have been constructed out of pride and scrap and were only a nasty storm away from collapsing. Didn't request anything from him, including his name, credentials, or clearance code. Thus, it didn't ask her anything you want. They lived above a warehouse that smelled of grease, and below them were plasma cartridges. Across the alley, and ex-con turned, and machines ran at strange hours, loud enough to drown out anything they didn't want to hear. For the criminal underworld, the courier operated a tight information circuit, and she never knocked twice. Estimal appreciated that. Additionally, during those initial days, she didn't say much aloud. Instead, her body spoke for her as she navigated their new. She seemed to be carrying electricity in her skin at home, and she wasn't sure if her limbs would short out from contact, but when she caressed Barry, and each kiss was slower and more purposeful, breath had purpose, and she spent every second away from military surveillance learning what it meant to want instead. Barry realized that this piece was a pause rather than a command, so he kept his hands firm and his weapons loaded. Assurance. On the 7th night, they heard a knock, not at the front door, but the rooftop hatch was up, so they froze. She moved silently, without pausing, barefoot and lethal before Barry. Pushed her back against the wall close to the hatch, one hand grabbing the little plasma blade she had concealed beneath the Barry. The radiator stood behind her heartbeat, but the tripwire didn't detect her voice. "Depart." They didn't ascend the drone, and Estimal muttered, "Surveillance." Perhaps she. The door gently hissed open when the control pad next to the wall was tapped, bypassing the manual lock. A little dark Barry raised his weapon as the canister fell through the opening and landed on the metal floor with a gentle clink. Opened with only a solitary hollow projector buzzing to life and no explosion. "Not to be a little human," a voice said. "Barry Carver, congratulations. You've made it farther than any model before you," the voice said, and your Estimal's eyes narrowed. "You were never intended to. We calculated neuronal dissonance instability in order to survive together, much less prosper. Rejection. But you formed a lasting friendship, and the information you now possess, especially your Estimal, is priceless." Barry moved in closer, but Estimal stated it's worse than the military. Voice continued to go as smoothly as a scalpel. "You're finally free, but only for as long as you continue to be valuable. If we wish to locate you, undress you, and reset her." Estimal's hands clenched. "So this is the offer. Come to the data shard's coordinates, and we'll talk without any limitations or resets. Information. the voice stopped, or remain hidden and hope nothing changes. After blinking once, the projector turned off, causing the canister to self-destruct in a clear cloud of white fire. Barry looked to her after Estimal remained silent for a moment. "What are you thinking?" Her voice was low and controlled. "Since you are the one who started it, they want you and my evolution. We don't have to react, but we do," she said. He studied her, but she intervened to keep him from leaving. Not for them, but for us. Barry grabbed her wrist as his hand sliced up beneath his shirt, palm flat against his chest. "I want to ignore them. That night, they plotted and rewired, so let's do it on our terms. They encrypted all traceable information and used the old communications port to send fake messages to 3 distinct colonies. Link in Barry's original documents, where the Estimal removed all of the signature lines and the identifiers from her neural trace. Barry stood as they were ghosts, with pulses from the experimental stabilizer still flowing through her system at daybreak. "Are you ready?" she asked, zipping up the armored vest she hadn't worn in weeks. He asked, turning to face me. "Now, you're injecting something into me," Barry remarked softly as she entered his personal zone. "I'll never be out of you," she whispered, kissing his neck. "You're mine now and forever." He took hold of her waist and smacked her hard, kissed him even harder, and said in a fiery voice, "Let's show them what a complete claim looks like." That afternoon, they left the city, but this time, they were conquering together rather than running. The air was thicker with dust and minerals, and the western continent was completely different from the cities they had fled. The sky had a continuous copper tint that bled into oranges and bruised reds as it clung to skin and lingered in the breeze. By evening, it was dry and cold, and the silence was sufficient to hear the scraping of the wind. It wasn't heaven against the cliffs, but it was theirs. They purchased a low-key home close to the mining basin. Triple-locked, tech-reinforced concrete windows with thermal insulation of the type of construction made to withstand earthquakes, storms, and unwanted attention. The Barry created a private clinic 2 blocks over from a legitimate but generally quiet one, although the broker only asked for credits rather than identities, surface wounds, lung cleaners, and occasionally bullet extractions. When the wrong guys chose the wrong types of altercations, he maintained a low profile as just another former military doctor with scarred hands and no inquiries. Didn't work, as people thought. She worked in the spaces where people watched, listened, and gave advice to a few. When tensions increased, underworld strategists disarmed a gunrunner once with just her gaze, and word quickly spread about her. Reputation developed on its own, but she stayed near home most of the time, and although it wasn't easy, they didn't actually argue. However, they disagreed about silence, space, and her preference for the windows. Sealed during the night, although he occasionally kept them open to listen to what was being cooked. However, the same dish, seared root meat and dried peppers in oil, was only served once a week, and Barry perspired through his. He coughed midway through the meal the first time she made it, and she smirked with scorching eyes across the table. She remarked, "You humans are so soft." When he completed his plate without leaning back and staring at her until she turned away, he flinched without saying anything and avoided discussing love. She pulled him back into bed before daylight every morning, pressing her, but they never touched as if it mattered. Every night, as if to remind herself that he was still real, she pressed her mouth to the middle of his chest, directly over his heart. 3 weeks in, and one night, Barry woke up with her wrapped against him like heat-seeking weapons that had finally found a home. Her mouth was flushed against his shoulder as he shifted, and she held onto him tighter than before. She shifted, putting one leg between his still throbbing. Barry ran a whisper. "You're awake. So are you." "From what?" she said, her voice a little breathy. "From the silence." He kissed her neck, saying, "You want." He threw her onto her back and settled, between her thighs, saying, "Noise, I want you inside me." She smiled. "So, are you sure they knew each other's rhythms and didn't rush? If so, what caused the breath to catch and the pulse to stutter?" As he pushed forward, her body matched his, and he moaned softly into his mouth, his claws running down, his back. He shaped about him as if they were no longer two individuals, and they later lay entangled in perspiration and her breath. "It no longer feels like survival," she whispered, "but rather like life," with his chest and lips against her temple. "That scares you a little." Barry exhaled. Why did she pause? It's not. They didn't speak for a while after he briefly ran his fingers through her hair, but the following morning she sat, watching the sky. Barry poured while sitting at the kitchen table, in nothing but one of his shirts, legs pulled up to her chest. He added, "You're not in the field anymore," to her coffee. I know he sat across from her, so you don't need to be on watch. Her fingers clenched on the mug, and every time you wait for the other shoe to drop, it always returns. They haven't located us yet. He extended his hand, palm up, across the table, and she paused. Barry nodded and continued. "You know that's right. You're not mine because of the compound. I don't crave you. I know that." Because of the stabilizer, she leaned forward and caressed his forehead. He put his hand around her neck and said, "I'm not going anywhere." That night, she let him carefully undress her, like it meant anything. And it did, since there was no crisis or drone in the area for the first time since they first met. There are only two people alive, no messages in the sky waiting to blow them up. And when Estimal dozed off in his arms, and the message arrived, on a satellite in low orbit, her heartbeat mirrored his exactly. Barry was the only one to detect the antiquated encryption ping on his clinic's concealed receiver at the medical clearance level. An Estimal stood behind him as the clear, unequivocal signal arrived from the council, which he had been ignoring for months. After reading it, we formally request an update on the subject of Estimal Raker's condition, especially with regard to emotional. The dilemma remained: is she still yours? Dependency, hormonal fluctuation, and brain bonding permanence. Barry didn't immediately respond to them. Instead, he turned in his chair and gazed at her. She appeared to be standing in the morning light, didn't belong to anything, except his shirt dangling loosely from her body and her face with eyes that had given up searching for conflict. She stated everything, even though she didn't want to, but she would if he asked her to. "Do you want me to answer?" he questioned in a low voice, and after walking to the table and picking up a half-empty cup of water, she wiped her. "They still think I'm broken," she murmured, covering her mouth with the back of her palm. "They think they lost control." "They did," Barry leaning back in the chair. "They're asking if I can fix you, not if I want to." She approached him, "And I don't need a cure," she replied, setting the cup on the table next to the terminal. He looked at her and said, "No, you're the outcome." It took him a week to come up with a response, not because he was at a loss for words, but rather because some realities require time to process. He explained that there was a refrigeration problem and closed the clinic for 2 days. No one contested that he spent the time writing notes rather than logs or reports, because the only patients who came here were the ones who understood how to wait or had nowhere else to go. Letters that nearly attempted to change Estimal's experience into something that didn't feel like a violation. He knew that she was experimenting with spices with a sort of willful curiosity. She could cook every third day. One night she burned an entire he ate the pan of root flesh, despite the fact that it was labeled experimental roasting. Purple skin wasn't common here, and she didn't bat an eye when people glanced at her in the street. She wasn't bothered by the residents' courteous and rather frightened stare, but Barry saw that she began lightly stroking his arm as they passed through the marketplace, as if to let everyone know she wasn't alone, as if to remind herself it was almost midnight when he eventually sat down to record the council's response. Were asleep on their bed, cuddled up in his pillow, and her legs were entangled under the sheet, as if she were clinging to something, even in her dreams, that he didn't document in data points. "When I first met Estimal, he told me a story. She should have died because she was bleeding out of her side, but I didn't follow protocol and instead utilized, and she was saved by an unapproved stabilizer, but it transformed her. She burned for weeks. Her blood attempted to rewrite itself, her skin refused every treatment, and she was unable to concentrate or sleep. She didn't simply survive, she changed. He hesitated, then continued. The connection wasn't as she reorganized. Her emotional systems around my closeness, which had the side consequence of recalibrating her. She adopted my breathing patterns and used me as the focal point of her identity. You want to know if that was a medical mistake, which it wasn't, and whether it's permanent. He looked at if you're wondering if she's still mine in the bedroom, she is. But I'm also hers. The next he discovered her sitting cross-legged and braiding her hair on the porch one day. Something about it felt softer, never weaker. Yet she just allowed him to see that he sat next to her, leaving her exposed and defenseless. She didn't look at him when he brought her a mug of spiced water, but he nodded and told them everything was okay, removed the braid and gave him a sidelong glance. You think they'll leave us alone? Barry put his head back against the railing, and she smiled slightly. I'd hate to be mistaken about them. They're coming to examine what they can't replicate, so let them try before they try to fix you, Esti. She rolled to her feet and, "Where are you going?" he questioned as she came into the home with her hips dancing, and she glanced over her shoulder, that evil. That night, she approached him gently with calm fingers, the light in her eye returning. To remind you why they're jealous, she rubbed herself against him, moving skin to skin, and her eyes whispered, "I choose you again." Every tremor and every gasp she made was genuine, and when she arrived, she shivered from the bottom of her heart as her body clasped around his, and instead of screaming, she mumbled his name after lying on his silently tracing circles on her chest with her finger. He whispered, "You still feel it?" "The bond?" She nodded against him. She kissed his chest, and it's not fading at all. "Are you comfortable with that?" They didn't want it to vanish, so they remained clasped together as he and I breathed. With the window open and the wind blowing in, the stars moved to a council, waited for a remedy, but nothing remained to do so. The basin was the sole thing they had decided to make unbreakable years later. The rust-coated soil continued to kick up into the air with each wind blow, and the sky continued to pulse with. The city continued to rely on illegal trade channels and smuggled electricity to sustain that perpetual bruise of copper light. Barely noticeable enough to avoid detection, yet within the ancient concrete home with the triple locks and everything had changed, and the Estimal was standing barefoot in the doorway of strengthened walls. As they watched Barry sleep across the room, in their tiny kitchen, sunshine streamed through the shutters, creating gentle light bars. His shirt had a half-on collar that was stretched across his shoulders and back, leaving his spine exposed. She had made more marks on that spine than she could remember, and although her body had shifted little, her skin remained that deep, bright violet, but now that the fire was still in her muscles, it was softer in some areas. Her edges had smoothed but not dimmed, and his berry hadn't stirred or turned, but it had simmered rather than burnt. Before either of them spoke, his eyes met hers, and his face appeared older rather than worn out, simply dressed comfortably, something that most fighters never experience. "You're observing me once more," he whispered. "I always do." He got up gradually and ran "I know that look." "She didn't deny it," he said, running his hand over his short hair. His eyes narrowed as he said, "No, I'm considering what might happen if we don't." Estimal walked across the room and took a seat. Barry nodded as she stated, "They found us on the bed next to him, knees pulled under her. I am aware that she gave him the chip, and she said that the recon drones swept the ridge yesterday without stopping or dropping anything." Barry turned the chip around in his fingers, but it noticed us and didn't interact. They're observing once more as she cocked her head up, reminding him that they're not a threat. The clinic had grown, Barry, and they will be waiting for a long time to see what we will accomplish. Barry kissed her temple. He taught 2 people to cure everything from fractured bones to lung scarring from dust storms to the rejection of black market augments. Both his human and alien assistants were devoted individuals who respected him, yet they didn't. In the meantime, he had become a half-spoken reality and a myth in the mining community. Half ghost story. Some claimed she disarmed a council bounty, while others stated she once mentally broke a man's arm. Squad, with only a smile, allowing them to converse at night after they had shut out the lights and secured the doors. Her touch wasn't frenzied. She curled into Barry's lap, legs straddling him, and put her kiss to the underside of his jaw. It was once held by someone you knew, and it's still electrifying and hers. "You still crave me?" she inquired. And when her breath warmed his skin, he drew her in and demonstrated it. However, 2 days later, a fresh message, this time a signal of recognition on Tilith command, arrived. Barry was no longer wanted and was not wiped when the Human Council mutually signed the estimate. Not forgiven, he said that it was bureaucracy, not love or forgiveness. That night, they stood on the roof together, eyes on the horizon, finally submitting to something beyond their control. Barry inquired if you were upset, and I replied, "No, you're not disappointed." Estimal grinned. "What else is it?" She turned to face him and put a palm to his chest, satisfied, and Barry took a deep breath that you never wanted. Tranquility prior to her kissing him, yet I desired you, and now you have both, earned both. So she drew him down to give him another calm, steady, deep kiss. The burden of the past didn't follow them indefinitely as they returned inside hand in hand.